If you've been listening along with the God Awful Movie Podcast, you'll know that we're currently working our way through a cinematic trilogy so abysmal the number 3 is embarrassed to be associated with it. It's the What Would Jesus Do trilogy, and these movies are unpleasant on a scale normally reserved for flesh-eating bacteria. Now, we're only 2/3 of the way through it, so there could be a twist in the third one where it turns out Jesus was a ghost the whole time or something. But as near as I can figure, the formula they were shooting for in this movie is person is bad, person meets person who is weird analog of Jesus, bad person asks what Jesus would do, bad person turns good. Now, I say that's what they're shooting for because the Hamlet monkeys that wrote these damn things have no fucking clue what bad and good are. And inevitably, the bad person is doing something bad, like getting paid to sing songs with naughty words in them, and the good thing Jesus would do is sing for free at a church instead. But they were shooting for good. And of course, trying to keep my brain from atrophying as I watch these things has inevitably led me to reflect on this little piece of bumper sticker wisdom that Christians love to throw around. It's also got me thinking about the wonders of carbon monoxide-rich atmospheres, but that's a different open in case of emergency diatribe, so I'll stick to the first point for now. What would Jesus do? Now, my first thought is, if your moral philosophy can fit on a bracelet, it's a shitty moral philosophy. But of course, to even formulate that thought, I have to give this concept way more credit than it deserves. What would Jesus do as a moral philosophy in the way that a Ouija board is a communication device? And obviously, there are a number of ways to dismiss this that are really fun, but kind of miss the point, right? Because, I mean, if you take it literally, the correct answer is shit himself stupid over things like doorknobs and zippers. But obviously, when Christians say this, they're not asking, what would an illiterate apocalyptic rabbi from a hick town in ancient Rome do in these present-day circumstances? And we all know that. But they're also not asking, what would a person with the ethical standards of that dude from the Gospels do? And generally, only we know that. Because, look, there's very little to go on in the Jesus mythology to inform us on basically everything. All we've got to go on is the Gospels, and as we demonstrated last week, it's not like he spent those things saying unambiguously moral shit. You know, he was hit and miss with a tendency towards miss. A heavy one at that. I mean, the closest he ever came to moral was the Golden Rule, which was by no means new and is by no means revolutionary or even particularly useful. It's like a childlike effort at codifying ethics, and it falls apart as soon as you start picking at it. So what would the biblical Jesus do? I don't know, maybe slather himself in nard cream or wash a foot or something. There's nowhere near enough data to draw an informed conclusion in any circumstance that a modern human might find themselves in. But of course, that's not the stumbling block in reality, because whether they recognize it or not, when Christians ask this, they're not asking what Jesus would do. All they're really asking is, what would a perfectly moral person do in this instance, right? I mean, they've created an image of Jesus that's only remotely informed by the biblical sources, and that image they've created is this selfless, omnibenevolent being that loves strangers and his enemies and shit. So when you look at what they're really asking, it almost stands up to scrutiny, right? I mean, if a person's chief moral heuristic is to ask themselves, what would a perfectly moral being do, and then do that thing, you can see how that's going to lead to a lot of good outcomes, regardless of how stupid the bracelets are. But of course, like most of the things that Christianity promotes, the problem shows itself as soon as you give it an ounce of critical thought, because when you strip it away from the self-congratulatory piety, all they're really doing is attaching a divine signature to their own moral intuition. Right? I mean, when one encounters a moral dilemma, one can't help but ask oneself what a perfectly moral being would do, because that's just a different way of saying, what is the moral thing to do here? Right? I mean, you no more have to formulate that question in your head than you have to think to yourself, this seems like a good time for a blink. Yeah, that innate question is implied by the very setup of encountering a moral dilemma, because having to ask oneself that question is what a moral dilemma is. So we all ask ourselves the same question in those circumstances. It's just that some of us pretend that our answers come from an infallible supernatural autocrat. Now, when you look at it from that angle, it's easy to see how it's going to lead to problems. Right, because you and I can have a productive conversation about what is and isn't the moral thing to do in a situation, but it's going to be a lot harder if I have to start by impugning the rectitude of Christ the Savior, especially if I've got nothing in my corner but a bunch of well-reasoned, data-driven arguments from fallible mortals. But it's actually a lot worse than that, precisely because Jesus is such an ill-defined character. Like, in our modern culture, the image of Jesus as this hyper-benevolent, selfless, charitable hippie is so ubiquitous that we often assume it's universal, but it isn't. It's not geographically universal, and it's not historically universal. Hell, it's not even particularly biblical. And even within this culture, it obviously doesn't take much to twist that dude into a benevolent, selfless, charitable hippie that also hates fags. I mean, let's say I take that story about Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple, and I say to myself, well, clearly, if you think that the people handling the money are crooked, the moral thing to do is to remove them from office with violent force. Now, here I've got this biblical justification right here, and according to all those bumper stickers and bracelets, I've satisfied the chief moral qualification of what Jesus would do, and now I have an obligation to act accordingly. Or take the fig tree that Jesus killed for refusing to bear fruit for him. Now, when you look at the other stuff that Jesus said about bearing good fruits and knowing them by their fruits, it'd be damn easy to interpret this story as a pretext for genocide. You know, with some trees, you just try, and even Jesus himself can't make them bear good fruits. So when a city or a nation or a race refuses to bear good fruits long enough, despite your concerted interventions, you just have to kill the whole tree. After all, that's what Jesus would do. And speaking of bearing good fruits, that's really the only meaningful measure of a moral imperative anyway, isn't it? What fruit has it borne? Well, throughout the history of Christianity, every devout believer was asking themselves that same question and, to varying degrees of commitment, behaving accordingly. So throughout the burning of pagan temples in Rome, the brutal pacification of heathens, the Dark Ages, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the witch hunts, the bloodiest parts of the Protestant Reformation, the pogroms, the genocide of native peoples all over the globe, the homophobia, the sexism, throughout all of that, the Christians behind it were asking themselves that same question. And every one of them found a way to convince themselves that this is exactly the kind of choir boy that Jesus would have raped. So how about a new question? WWJD. What does Jesus do? He divorces you from moral culpability. He gives you an out. He gives you a chance to say, "No, sir, officer, when the car hit that fence, Jesus had taken the wheel." And if you want to see this in action, you need to look no further than the homophobia rallies where Bible thumpers are perfectly happy to explain exactly who the fag hater in chief is. Jesus isn't a guide, he's an excuse. And if you were moral in the first place, you wouldn't need an excuse.